Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now, if you've seen the previous episode, we kind of got into qualitative research. We were talking a little bit about focus group guides, and we were talking a little bit about in-depth interviews as well. And so today what we're going to be talking about is a little bit of preparation for the interview, be it in-depth interview, be it focus group guide. And we're also going to be talking about pulling out themes and making sure that our focus group or in-depth interview is valid or has some sort of reliability to it. So let's get started. So the interview itself, be it an in-depth interview in which you're interviewing one person, or if you are interviewing 5 or 7 people at once, otherwise known as a focus group, you want to be sure to ask follow-up questions when appropriate. And again, this is assuming that you are following an unstructured approach in which you might ask follow-up questions during the interview process. For the interview itself, you should feel free to jot down words, not full sentences. Remember that your time is limited when you're listening to people. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to make sure that you have it recorded. I highly recommend a video recording system. It'll allow you to really get into the interview, not worry about noting things, and you'll be more focused on your participants. Consider what you wear to the interview. This is incredibly crucial. As you can see right now with what I'm wearing, I'm kind of laid back in a sense. I'm wearing a button down. I have a white undershirt here, as you can see, and I'm kind of low key. Certainly somebody would take me seriously, but I'm also approachable. This is actually quite important when you're conducting research. If I showed up with a suit and tie on, would people open up to me? Probably not. If I was hoping that, I'd be able to run a focus group or in-depth interview in a prison or in a low-income neighborhood, holding some sort of in-depth interview or focus group with a suit and tie on would be very, very detrimental to the process itself. It's likely that nobody would open up to me, and why should they? And so you really, really want to be careful about this. I was actually helping some students when I was at the University of Florida with their PR campaign. And so they were interested in holding focus groups about banking with people from the lower income area of Gainesville, Florida. And so I asked them, what do you think you guys are going to wear? And one of them said, I'm just going to wear a suit and tie. I said, absolutely not. You will not do so. You will not have a very good focus group. You want to make sure that you dress down. No logos, no brands, just, professional. And this would be business casual. And so appearance is very, very important. Now, if you're a journalist and if you're interviewing someone, suit and tie is usually the way to go. But as we've seen on CNN, on Fox News, not everybody wears a suit and tie. So of course, there are always exceptions to this. Let's move on. Now, when you're preparing questions for the interview, as I've said before, you want to be sure to ask follow-up questions and probing questions. Remember, as the interviewer or moderator, you are navigating the interview. You are the road. And so people, your participants, are just following you. You guide the conversation. Remember that. Questions are meant to guide the conversation along. You have way more control than you think you do during a focus group or during an in-depth interview. There are a few things you'd like to avoid, though. One is questions that are answerable without the interview. Do your research. Do not ask a police officer how many African American cops are currently working in New York City. It's a very dumb question. Why? Because you can look it up. The information is readily available. I promise you, if you ask silly questions or questions that can already be answered without a participant answering, they will get frustrated. Participants will get frustrated. They won't take you seriously. They'll say, why is this person asking questions about Black Lives Matter? He hasn't done his research. He's asking questions to which the answers are already out there. So make sure that you avoid that at all costs. Leading questions, hostile, loaded questions, you want to avoid these at all costs. Leading question could be leading someone to a particular answer that you're giving. Do you think that teenagers should be independent? Sure. So then you probably think that teenagers should be able to get abortions without their parents' permission. So those kinds of questions you want to kind of avoid. One, because they're very controversial. Though that topic of whether or not a teenager should be able to get an abortion on her own is incredibly controversial. Two, it kind of locks the participant into answering in a particular way. And, as stated at the bottom of the PowerPoint, could lead to hostility. We want to avoid these kinds of questions. And so, while we're guiding participants with where the conversation is going, we don't want to guide what they're going to say. It's not good ethically, be it as a focus group moderator, be it as a journalist. Let's go to the next slide. So, mapping out qualitative research, you really need to think about, what do I need to know? And why do I need to know this? This is incredibly important, and it's the first step that we have when we're creating a focus group interview guide. Why do I need to know this? So to kind of answer this question, the best way to go about this is to do research. And so what you might do is you might read up on previous studies and other things that are available in an academic library to get a sense of what's already been studied, what's already known. You might look at consumer reports, you might look at Nielsen or ComScore if you're in industry to better understand what's going on with consumers so that you're not looking at something that's already been investigated. Additionally, you want to think about what kind of data will answer the question. And you want to think about what you're going to be pulling from this focus group. We're having a conversation about cartoons, or we're having a conversation about 90s nostalgic cartoons and why adults 25 to 40 are still watching these nostalgic cartoons like Hey Arnold or like Real Monsters on Nickelodeon. And so you want to make sure that while you're having this conversation, you're actually pulling out information that's useful to your project. Where can I find the data? You might find a lot of qualitative research data in colleges and universities. That's why I mentioned earlier an academic library. You might be able to look up studies that have already explored particular kinds of phenomena. And so you want to think about, for instance, if you're doing a movie study, do you go to a movie theater and interview people after seeing the latest Avengers or Transformers or Jurassic Park to get a better sense of why people like action-packed movies? You could do that. What does that do for your sample? What does it not do for your sample? And so thinking about how you're going to get your sample of participants is really, really critical. For the theater example we just had, well, one positive notion here is that if you're pulling people who just saw Jurassic Park, they just saw it, so the movie is fresh in their minds. What's kind of a negative notion of this? It's the same thing. You're pulling people who just saw Jurassic Park, they really haven't been able to process all of it yet, and you pull them into a room and hold a focus group. So there are pros and cons to any decision that you make. None of this is concrete. It is social science. Social science is meant to give us an idea, some sense of the world, some sense of its mechanisms and how it operates, but it by no means purely and completely and categorically defines phenomenon around the world. It just doesn't. But it does give us an incredibly great sense of what is going on. And this is why scholars work so hard in pursuing social science. Let's go to the next slide. Let's keep mapping out qualitative research. To whom do I contact for access to participants? Depending upon if you're using college students, you might contact department chairs of colleges and universities. If you're looking to run focus groups with middle school students or high school students, you'll have to get permission from middle schools and high schools. You'll likely be talking to principals, maybe even superintendents of the school districts. If you're looking to pull out participants from a movie theater, you're probably going to need permission from the movie theater chain itself, most likely the public relations department, to give you clearance to conduct some sort of focus group or in-depth interview. Now, this is an example of timeline. To do this kind of work can take very, very long. For instance, if in September you obtain millennials for movie theater research, you might not have the focus groups themselves until October. So in September, you might be recruiting, you'll send out a survey asking people what movies they've seen, and then, of course, you have to plan ahead, so it might be 2 to 3 weeks until you run your first focus group, if not later. And then your final deliverable may be in November or December of that year. Because again, between recording focus groups, listening to them, pulling out themes, putting together a PowerPoint, or an academic study, it's going to take some time. For instance, recently, I was fortunate to do some focus groups for Bravo Television. And so we were talking about the study really since January 2017. We didn't have the focus group guide finalized until May 2017, and there was really no delivery until November 2017. And so it can take a while. Now, granted, students were out for summer. There were other complications given the university calendar that stifled this study. I suspect that if this was an industry, we probably would have started talking about this in January of 2017, and it would have been done by about April 2017. Unfortunately, in academia, things tend to run slower. And so this is important to note for those of you who are aspiring professors, as well as the rest of you who are more likely to be in industry. Focus groups do take a little bit longer, but there are firms now that turn around focus group recordings within a day, believe it or not. So you can submit a video of an hour focus group and have it transcripted by the next day. What we mean by transcription is that you will have literally a script of what people have said. And so it's very, very useful when you're trying to pull out themes and things that people are talking about. Let's go to the next slide. The validity of your research. How do you know that your study is valid? And so there's internal validity and external validity. Internal validity surrounds whether or not the mechanisms or measurements that you used actually measured what you were looking for. For instance, if you're trying to figure out brand loyalty toward NBC TV channel, you might ask questions about brand loyalty. But if you start asking people about how much they value NBC, it's no longer a question about loyalty. It's a question of value or equity. Are you really measuring brand loyalty anymore? Or are you just trying to see how much people value NBC? Many people might value PBS or National Geographic Channel or the Discovery Channel. But are they loyal to it? Probably not. And so it's really, really important to think about the kinds of questions that you're asking and really making sure that you're measuring what you think you're measuring. That falls under internal validity. External validity deals with generalizability. We don't really have that in focus group research, though, or in in-depth research for that matter. External generalizability states, well, we have these results. Can we generalize these to the sampling frame population? So for instance, if we're talking to 25 to 35-year-olds about video gameplay, and we do focus groups to kind of understand why and how they play video games, and in particular, nostalgic video games, can we generalize this to the rest of the population? Maybe. For focus group research, unfortunately, it's usually purposeful sampling that happens. And so we're really only pulling people that kind of fit into the sample that we want to investigate. We're only pulling 25 and 35-year-olds that play nostalgic video games. And so usually there's no randomization, right? We usually don't randomly select people. And so there's less of an opportunity to really generalize focus groups for that matter. In fact, most qualitative research really isn't generalizable to the public. After all, it's an incredibly small sample and there's no randomization. And so external generalizability usually is on the lower end. What has a lot of external generalizability are usually surveys, because surveys, if they have a randomized sample, usually are able to generalize their findings to the rest of the population. And so that's something to bear in mind with qualitative research. Not necessarily generalizable, but it definitely gives us insights. Let's look back at that slide. And so respondent validation is one way that we can make sure that we have validity in qualitative research. This means that you can compare the data and findings with the participants from whom you drew information. And so I might invite the 5 to 7 participants I had in a focus group study to look at my results and ask them, what do you think? Does this make sense? Did I pull out the right themes? Another thing that you can do to ensure validity is to have long, rich interviews. This really allows you to delve into a particular process or whatever is under your lens of investigation, if you will. And so you're able to really, really dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the subject matter. And so having a focus group for an hour, having a focus group for an hour and a half is incredibly useful. I have triangulation written at the bottom because, as I said in the previous episode, it's really important, if you can, to do some qualitative research and some quantitative research about the same subject matter. It really helps fuse together your results. I do this all the time with my students at CUNY. The idea is that with qualitative research, we understand the how and why behind a process, and with quantitative research, we can ask a large number of questions to a large number of people via survey. And so together, it's really, really an optimal blend in understanding consumer behavior and consumer perception. Let's go to the next slide. Certainly, we could not talk about validity without reliability. Reliability is a little bit difficult, once again, in qualitative research. How do we know that something is reliable? Reliable, or reliability, really means the replicability. How replicable is this study? The theories, the variables that were used. Can the same things that were found here manifest if we did this over again? That's what we're looking for here. Well, we can do this in a few ways. First, we can repeatedly use the same interview guide, right? If I hold 3 focus groups on a new Warner Brothers Batman video game or on the next Jurassic Park movie, as long as I have the same set of questions in each focus group, there's some sort of reliability throughout all of them. So that works out really well. You can also, although it's very difficult to do, have multiple scholars overlooking the process and results of your focus groups. But it's very, very difficult to do this. Scholars usually don't have a lot of time to spend, number one. And number two, it usually doesn't mean very much for their own career to invest in looking over somebody else's research. And so it's very difficult to achieve. If you are a grad student or a college professor, the best that you can do is collaborate with other people, which will help you in determining if the focus group themes make sense or if what you're finding is what other people are finding. And that's usually the optimal way to ensure reliability in qualitative research. Let's look at the next slide. So, as stated in the earlier episode, when you're constructing the interview guide, ask simple questions. You want to think of your audience. I think your questions, frankly, should be at an 8th grade level. You don't want anything too sophisticated. Be careful when you're using words like detrimental and unfettered. These may be words that you may or may not know, but if you don't know them, you may feel ignorant or you may feel stupid. And as a result, you do not want your participants thinking that. You also don't want them to think that you're arrogant. You don't want them to think that you're putting them down in any way either. So we're avoiding all of these things by just making sure our language is clear and concise and transparent. And so be mindful of that when you're constructing your focus group interview guide. Let's look at the next slide. Extracting themes from qualitative research. What I recommend is the following here. So if you're creating themes and categories, one way to do this is the constant comparative technique, and I've used this before. What you might want to do is go through one focus group transcription. And again, a focus group transcription is what was spoken about at the focus group session written down. So you might have a video recording of an hour focus group session on Kraft macaroni and cheese, and then you might give it to a transcription firm. They might turn it around in an hour, and from your recording, they have a 40-page PDF of what was said, and it literally looks like a script. It's very, very useful. And so from here, you might say, okay, for each focus group question that I asked, what were people saying? That's a really nice way to organize this. If you have 10 focus group interview questions that you asked, you might, for each question, look at the first focus group and see what was said, and then the second, and then the third. And so you're going question by question and really looking at whether there's a theme. A theme is something that appears in each focus group session. Going back to the Kraft macaroni and cheese example, it could very well be everybody wants chili on their macaroni and cheese. I don't know. Everybody's looking for paprika or chili or something spicy. If they say it in the first focus group for the third question, and if that happens again in the second focus group, and it happens again in the third focus group, we've got a theme. Obviously, people are looking for chili, or it could be paprika in their macaroni and cheese. So this may mean that we have to look into a new flavor and go to the flavor department and do some research. And so that's one way to really look at developing themes in a focus group. You're essentially comparing answers across from each focus group. And that's a good thing. You want people answering and responding in the same way from focus group session to focus group session. If you don't, it could mean a whole host of things. It could very well mean that maybe some of the participants are maybe Kraft macaroni and cheese doers to the point in which they eat it all the time, which might skew your sample. Or you might have some participants who, for whatever reason, were able to get into the focus group session and really don't eat Kraft macaroni and cheese. Or they may be disinterested in the focus group, or there could be a whole host of other things. Or it could very well be that there might be other things about Kraft macaroni and cheese flavors you didn't take into consideration. And so that's why you're having different responses from each focus group. So you're really looking for continuity here. What we're hoping to reach is saturation, not saturated fat, saturation. What we want is the same responses in each focus group. That means we have a theme. Something is going on here, and we're finding something that we can put into a report or put into an academic study. That's what we're looking for. Let's go to the next slide. When you're creating themes, you want to be mindful of the evidence that you have. Do not go over the cliff with this. If some participants say they like seeing some of the Real Housewives on Bravo television fighting, don't say consumers want to see Real Housewives injured or bleeding in next episode. They're not saying that. Stay within the scope of your evidence. Be careful of the conclusions that you draw. You are limited by your evidence. You absolutely are. And do not go beyond it. If your evidence is a circle, don't go outside of the circle. Moreover, consider if something is nuanced or if there's a pattern. And remember, don't generalize. We can't do that here. The most we can say is that insights are being drawn here. Well, that's it for Late Night Learning. Thank you very much for joining us today. As always, keep laughing, keep learning.